We'll go ahead and get started. This is a joint seminar with M³ and CGD, and I'm pleased to welcome Ben Maybee. Ben is a postdoc in the School of Earth and Environment of the University of Leeds in the UK. He joined the Leeds group in 2021 following a PhD in high energy physics at the University of Edinburgh, and has worked on topics including East African rainfall variability, UK flash flood forecasting, and convection-permitting models. Welcome.
Okay, thank you all for coming. So yeah, the subject of this talk, as in the title, is going to be a lot on MCSs and wind shear, but generally the wider context is environmental controls on convection, land surface interactions, and then also convection-permitting modeling. So all the results I'm going to show here are from the Met Office Unified model, but we're in the wider context of the push towards explicit modeling of convection at about 5 kilometre-ish scale. So I'm actually here on behalf of many people. So I'm part of a project in the UK called LMCS. So this is funded by the UK National Environmental Research Council. So there's a group of us at Leeds, me, John Marsham, Doug Parker, also Yutong Liu, who's a PhD student from China. But the project is being led from UKCH by Chris Taylor and Connie Klein. And the wider context is looking at the influence of land-atmosphere interactions on MCSs globally, but you'll see quite a big bias to West Africa, and it's in the title. So just a very quick summary. I'll introduce the rationale for that grant, really, and the wider context in which I'm working. And then the 3 bits of work I'm going to focus on and show you the details of are looking at results from the UM, looking at how MCS rainfall scales with shear and the role of entrainment, looking at the role of cold pools in that rainfall scaling, and also looking at very brief results on the interactions with the land surface. So a big motivation for this, I'm sure all of you have seen lots of different various pushes and advertisements on this kind of thing, is the increasing growth in technical capability that's allowing multiple centers globally now to run 5 kilometre explicit deep convection models globally. And part of the aim why you might want to do this is to resolve long-standing biases that we see in CMIP. So for example, this is the rainfall bias against trim in multiple generations of CMIP. You can see it's completely wrong over the West Pacific warm pool. So there's the diamond panoply of multiple centers models, but for 40 days. Next Gems is the MPI and ECMWF in Europe, running 30 years, 5 kilometre data. It's also SCREAM here at DOE, I believe. Apologies if I get people's models affiliated to the wrong centers in the US. So we know, people are doing all sorts with these things, right? But I'm going to focus on MCSs. We know that models with explicit convection significantly improve the behavior of MCSs. So for example, the diurnal cycle is a huge improvement. In parameterized models, you get all the convection going off at midday, whereas in, for example, West Africa, it's later, it's at 18 UTC. So they improved that, they improved the direction of propagation, the general life cycle, so from formation to development of anvils to dissipation. Speeds are much more accurate. So lots of things look good. So classic cynical physicist, are there any problems? And obviously the answer is yes, there are a lot of problems. And they're going to feed into these new big fancy models, and we need to evaluate them. So Zhefeng at PNNL has done loads of work, loads of really good work on this. And particularly when they applied tracking algorithms to all the diamond models, they found a huge variability in what MCSs look like in all the different models. So you take everyone's favorite 5 kilometre model, the MCSs look completely different. They do lots of different things. So we need to understand why, what in the models is making this kind of variability happen. And a systematic thing we find across all models is there's an overestimation of how much intense rainfall you got. You don't get enough of the broad light rainfall out of the stratiform decks of these storms. So a plug for something I've been involved in, and many people here at NCAR, including Julia, is the MCS-MIP is a model into comparison, but of trackers for MCSs that Zhe has led. There's a preprint for this now, where we've used multiple trackers in multiple diamond models to kind of tease out systematic, it's not the method and it's not the model, what's wrong with the storms in these new fancy models people are making. But another thing I'm going to focus on is another known failure that we found in a UK MetUM model, which is a failure around wind shear. So In the observations, in this histogram on the left, what you've got is max rainfall from MCSs in West Africa, and then you've got the precursor zonal shear and precursor low-level humidity on the y-axis. And you can see as you increase the shear, the maximum rainfall goes up. And as you increase the low-level humidity, it goes up, and they're both linear. The model on the right is a model called CP4 Africa that's 6 years old now. So this was a 4.5 kilometer explicit model covering the whole of Africa for 10 years. This showed improvements in diurnal cycle, it showed improvements in propagation, but you can see if you look at the rainfall scaling against the shear on the x-axis, you'd get no change in how much rainfall you get with shear in this model. So it doesn't capture somehow the dynamical response of the storms to the precursor dynamical environment, which is a problem in the specific context of Africa, because we know that wind shear is playing a role already in changes being seen over the Sahel. So this is a paper by Chris from 2017. And what they found is in the observational records, so no models involved here, it's all from satellite obs, and for the rainfall at the ground stations, is the frequency of intense storms has gone up a lot. It's triple, it's in the title. But the reason for this is from dynamical causes. It's from the shear. So they've found Saharan warming is increasing the meridional temperature gradient against the Gulf of Guinea up to the Sahara, across the Sahel band, which is where there's a big density of storms. That's increasing the easterly mid-level winds. So MCSs in West Africa are controlled by African easterly jet at 650 hectopascals-ish. And this has increased the zonal shear. And as you increase the zonal shear, you just saw on the last plot in observations, you increase how much rainfall comes out of the storms. So the frequency of the storms with intense rainfall is increasing from that. So there's a land surface interaction, a synoptic scale land surface interaction, leading to an observed intensification of storms. But the one CP model we had, this great CP model they ran at the Met Office doesn't capture that interaction. So it's an issue in these CP models already there. So this mechanism whereby you have a meridional temperature gradient, increases easterly winds somewhere, higher shear, higher MCS rainfall. This isn't just in West Africa. I focus on West Africa a lot, but obviously the rest of the world has MCSs too. So this is a paper that's in review by Emma Barton, the other postdoc on our project. She's looked at the kind of semi-arid regions globally, highlighted in that map, looked at the temperature gradients across those, and looked at the relationship between the shear in that region and rainfall. So she's normalized them into quintile bins based on the local shear environment. Some it's westerly, some it's easterly. And in all of them, conditional upon the moisture in the atmosphere, you get an increase in MCS rainfall with shear. So this is from 20 years of observations using Zhefeng's PyFlex tracker dataset. This has also been seen for oceanic MCSs. It's not just on the land. So there's Jinya Chen from Penn State did a nice GRL paper where they showed this with a linear increase of storm lifetime rainfall with wind shear. So we see this effect globally. It's not just Africa, even though I'm going to talk about Africa for most of this talk. So focus on Africa. I appreciate not everyone is doing it. You probably have all seen bits of this before. So the key thing is you've obviously got a big desert north of semi-arid region and then lots of forests, right? You've got a strong meridional temperature gradient. This is actually the soil moisture field here from our model. So as well as temperature gradient, you've got a gradient in the soil moisture with wet soils further south to desert to the north. So the region has very strong zonal shear. So the green contours in my two middle plots are the difference between the 650 and the 850 hectopascal zonal winds. Why would you want to choose those levels? So the climatology is dominated by an easterly jet at 650, which is where the strongest winds are. So this has a speed of about 12 to 15 meters per second going easterly, whereas at the lower levels, you've got a monsoon flow going, the large-scale monsoon. So this, I'm looking JJA, or August, September kind of time of year. I'm only looking in the rainy season. So you can see you've got a strong band of zonal shear centered about 15 degrees north in the band that's the Sahel, where it's the semi-arid Sahel region of West Africa. The total column water moisture gradient is reversed. You've got high moisture down south by the coast, going out to very, very dry atmosphere in the Sahara. So the MCSs sit mostly just south of the peak shear, but they're mostly in the Sahel, in this region where they're being influenced by the easterly jet. They're being influenced by this very strong shear conditions, which does have a pronounced diurnal cycle through the day. This is just at the peak of convection, which is in the late afternoon. So for these observed MCSs, what I've done is, Emma and Connie did, is take 20 years of Meteosat for brightness temperature observations and then just threshold it to -50, this is for, and an area bigger than 5,000 kilometers squared. And then the rainfall is from iMerge. There aren't many good observations in the Sahel, so we're just using satellite. And then the histogram on the right is then binning these by their environmental characteristics. So like you saw for that published plot. So this is again zonal shear on the x-axis and then atmospheric total column water on the y-axis. And these variables for the observations, these are from ERA 5. They're taken about 6 hours before the storms to try and preclude the possibility of the storm interacting on its environment. We want to see how the storm is responding to the environment rather than influencing it. The big gray area is I've restricted the domain to the 5th and 95th percentile of the environmental conditions, just to avoid any outlier extremes. So the reason I'm laboring this a bit is I'm going to play exactly the same game with the models. So it's going to be storms, -50 degrees, bigger than 5,000 kilometers squared, across West Africa. And I'm going to look at the shear conditions and the total column water at 12 at midday and see how the storm rainfall responds to those variables. And similarly, all the models have a kind of Gaussian distribution in both. These are independent drivers. There's no significant correlation between these in any of the models, apart from the parameterized one, if I remember correctly. And they all have quite a similar distribution of where the storms sit. So that's atmospheric background. We've also got the land-atmosphere interactions and the interactions on the MCSs. So I've already kind of hinted at the results Emma's done and synoptic scale interactions. So this is the same kind of thing as that paper by Chris, where you have a large-scale temperature gradient. It's responsible for that increase in shear that's then pushing storms into the higher rainfall bracket in that shear distribution. So Emma has found the same mechanism to hold in all of those boxes I showed you over the globe. So this one on the left is the poleward, just normal temperature gradient. So it's thermal wind balance. You can go and do the same prediction using the thermal wind relationship. It looks exactly the same. So this one's maybe not such a surprise. But then you also find that this relates to the soil moisture gradient. So the temperature gradient itself is correlated to this large scale soil moisture gradient. You've got dry soils and wet soils setting up this gradient in temperature, and therefore the zonal shear. There's a significant correlation across all of these. The crosses are the MCS days. The circles are the climatology. So for example, in West Africa, which is green, the climatology and the MCS days are barely distinguishable because there are a lot of MCSs in West Africa. But in China, which is in orange, they're quite different. So that's synoptic scale. You've got large-scale soil moisture patterns driving favorable conditions for MCS extreme rainfall. But there's also a mesoscale relationship to this. So this is in observations, and this is now just the Sahel in West Africa. And this is from, again, 20 years of satellite observations. And what Connie and Chris found was mature storms are favored over dry soil moisture anomalies, and dry, not wet. So this field here is the soil moisture anomaly at 12 midday before mature MCS cores at 5 in the evening. So you're finding a preference for mature large MCSs to propagate over dry soil moisture anomalies. They filtered out for initiation effects, they filtered out orography, they filtered out precursor cold clouds, so you filter out as many things as you can think of to get rid of any other influences on the storms. And you find this very clear signal for a dry soil moisture anomaly where you have big mature storms. Now this then, so then you can ask, well, how is the soil moisture anomaly influencing the strength of the MCS and its preferred propagation? So the plots on the middle and the right, the one on the middle is 925 hectopascal divergence, and the black line is the intertropical discontinuity, a dry line. And so what they hypothesized was that the dry line shifts because of the soil moisture. So you're getting a kind of dynamical effect where the land surface is causing changes in the dry line that then lead to changes in the shear, which is the contours on the far right. So the land surface on the mesoscale is changing the atmospheric conditions such that you get favored mature convection. And the thing you're probably thinking is, is that source of predictability in some way? And the answer is yes. There is a live nowcasting portal, which I can show anyone who's interested, that's run by UKCH, where they use just the land surface to do 6-hour forecasts of where MCSs are going to go in West Africa. And Chris is also doing work at the moment where this extends out to multi-day predictability. So we have synoptic and mesoscale land interactions going on behind everything I'm going to say. And that was West Africa, and this isn't work I'm involved in, but just to highlight that you do see similar things in other regions of the globe. So this is work by a PhD student, Yutong Liu, who I showed the photo of on the first slide, from Nanjing University. So they have a 20-year wharf simulation over China. And what they're doing is looking at how MCSs over China respond to land surface mesoscale anomalies in the same way. This is the same plot as I showed before. So it's shading is the soil moisture anomaly. And you can see it's quite different to how it was for West Africa. It's now sat much more on a gradient, rather on that dry soil moisture patch. And what they're also finding is that the precursor moisture conditions and precursor rainfall build this kind of anomaly up to 4 days in advance of the storm propagation. So it's quite different to West Africa, but seeing similar kind of mesoscale effects that they're investigating further, and will get written up at some point soon. There is a preprint out on their model, but not the soil moisture bit. Okay, so I'm going to turn to my bits now. Are there any questions so far? Great. Okay, so what you might pose as a natural question is, why did that model get that wrong? It's natural kind of thing to evaluate. We spend all these money making all these models. Why did it get it wrong? What can we fix it? What do you need to do to improve a model? Because if all the new global 5-kilometer, 30-year models get that relationship wrong and it's related to the shift in the signal and MCS intensity with a warming climate, then that's quite a large problem, right? So that's the subject of this bit. And for this, what I'm going to do is use that model and some newer models from the unified model. So I'm making use of an ongoing initiative at the Met Office called the K-Scale project. I think this was actually initiated by John Petch, if I understand correctly. But this is looking at the role of regional refinement, boundary conditions, and domain size on convective explicit modeling. So what they've got going is a global 12-kilometer parameterized model driving a whole nest of regional models, including this very funky cyclic tropical channel, which I'm going to call TROP5. It's 5-kilometer-ish explicit resolution. It's got a funny grid. So this is like a pseudo-global model where there are lateral boundary conditions going meridionally, but there's no boundary conditions only. It's free to do whatever it wants only. There's no boundary conditions forcing it at the dateline. So you can spin up any kind of equatorial waves you want, and it's fully convection permitting across the whole tropics, but it isn't global. So I've got an explicit one of these, and I've got a parameterized one of these. And these are about 5 kilometers, and they're only 40 days. So that's an important caveat. They're quite short, but they are fully explicit with a pretty advanced accompanying set of physics parameterizations that comes under a very fancy acronym of RAL3. That if you go to any Met Office talks, you'll hear lots about RALs and GALs, and it's indecipherable. What this means is it's got a 2-moment microphysics scheme, it's got a bimodal cloud scheme, it's got a fully realistic land surface emulator, and it's got an improved turbulence scheme over older versions of the UM, which include our friend CP4 Africa, which is the one I showed you the failed shear relationship for. So CP4 covers this green box, covers the whole of Africa. It's at 4.5 kilometers, and it's explicit convection, and it goes for 10 years. So it's much longer and much better for statistics, right? As well as the current climate simulations, well, this has a future climate simulation that was the subject of a lot of work in the FCFA project at the Met Office. So I'm going to focus on storms over West Africa in August primarily, so peak season of the West African monsoon, also the diamond summer, and they're going to be in the gold box, which is my West Africa domain, which is where the West African monsoon is active in this season. This is where most of the MCSs are. And the observations I've already shown you, this is the 20 years of Meteosat with ERA 5 for the environmental conditions and iMerge for the rainfall. A very important thing to say about this, aside from the science, is if anyone is interested in using any of these models, the Met Office has a fabulous attitude towards sharing data at the moment. So, I mean, this data wasn't made to look at MCSs. It was just made available on a platform we have in the UK called Jasmine, and I was able to use it. So get in contact with Hugh Lewis if you're at all interested in the kind of data that's being made. They're also running a new CP4 Africa simulation, which I can talk about more to anyone who's interested. So how do these do with the MCSs and their relationship to the shear? So you've seen these two plots before, just in a slightly different format. So you see in the observations, you've got increasing shear on the x-axis, increasing max MCS rainfall on the histogram, whereas in the old model, CP4 Africa, you don't get an increase in rainfall with shear, but you do get it with total column water. Now, if you look at the third histogram, this is the new explicit model. So this is a 5 kilometer grid spacing model. So it's slightly coarser than CP4, but you can see that with both environmental variables, you're getting an increase in the max rainfall in the storm. So something has changed in the model configuration that's meaning the MCSs in this newer, noisier because it's shorter, but in the new generation simulations are picking up on that relationship. The parameterized model on the right doesn't get this, and you can also see that the relationship against the total column water is completely wrong. Whereas it should be increasing as you increase the environmental moisture, it's actually decreasing. So part of this is you're running a parameterized model at 5 kilometers. So you're getting a very funny interaction between the parameterization scheme and the explicit convection. There is explicit motion going on. They're not talking to each other, right? So what happens is this gets overwhelmed by the explicit convection at low total column water, and you get stupidly high updraft velocities. It's also probably something in the convection scheme where it's a cape closure scheme. It's somehow entraining wrong. So for example, when you use low level humidity, it doesn't look so bad. So it's something in the mid layers and the entrainment that's breaking it. So the plots, the line graphs are just the one-dimensional reductions of those 2D histograms, but just to look at the isolated scalings. So CP4 is my gold line, so the old model. The green line is the observation. So you can see for the total column water, actually CP4 is pretty good in terms of its scaling, but it's got too much rainfall, which we saw earlier is a pretty common characteristic of these models. But for the shear, it's really flat. Like you can see in the histogram, it's just not changing with the rainfall. Whereas the new explicit simulation, so the red line is 5 kilometers and the purple line is 2 kilometers. These are increasing too strongly with the total column water, but they are scaling linearly with the wind shear, which is the improvement we wanted to see, right? Especially the purple one, it's got a statistically indistinguishable gradient of the scaling with shear from the observations. Whereas the parameterized one is completely off. And this, the UM specifically among all global CP models being too sensitive to environmental moisture is actually something that's come out of the MCS MIP comparison. So other models, they all have their idiosyncrasies, right? One of them is the UM has a very strong sensitivity to total column water, and we're seeing that here. So, okay, it improved in the new model. Why? Physically. Right? Well, what did they do that changed this? And so this is where I'm going to refer to a very nice paper by Jake Mulholland and Hugh, among others, where they looked at the effect of zonal wind shear on the size of core updrafts in idealized numerical mid-latitude experiments with MCSs. And they found larger core sizes in higher, stronger, low-level shear environments. And those core sizes, the stronger cores, showed decreased entrainment, increased vertical velocity coming from buoyancy, and increased buoyancy. This has also been linked to rainfall explicitly by Sophie Abramian, who's in Paris. And this is actually the opposite scaling for a bulk entrainment measure that's been found for moisture. So Becker and Hohenegger in 2021, pretty much the same time. They also showed an increase in the core size with increased moisture, but they found an increase in the entrainment rate, rather than the decrease that you might expect in their bulk entrainment measure. So conceptually, higher shear, you get bigger MCSs, wider updrafts, and the temperatures relate to the measure I'm about to give you. So this is in a 200-meter LES model, resolving everything, you're actually resolving entrainment. I've got a thing that's at 5 kilometers. I can't do that, and I don't have any tracers. So I'm going to use some proxies for the bulk entrainment. So the first one of these is WF. So this is the efficiency of the conversion of CAPE into updraft velocity. So it's the ratio of the 500 hectopascal maximum vertical velocity in an MCS to the environmental CAPE. So as that goes up, entrainment is decreasing because your more CAPE is going into vertical motion. Then I've also got BT diff, which is the difference between the anvil heights and the level of neutral buoyancy. So when that's smaller, the anvils are closer to their level of neutral buoyancy and corresponds to decreased entrainment. So how do these look for all the models? I appreciate there's a lot of plots going on here. So the key thing is, firstly, if you look at the first two columns and the linear scalings in the middle, you can see that WF is going up as you increase the shear for the MCSs, and BT diff is going down. It's steeper in the 2 kilometer model where you've got higher vertical velocities, but in both of these are both the new generation explicit models, you're getting this scaling. So this corresponds to the decrease in entrainment proxy with shear, just like as is seen in numerical experiments. So the models are picking up on this effect. For the parameterized model, again, it's a bit all over the shop, but the key one is CP4. So CP4 is that old model with the broken wind shear relationship. There's no scaling of the entrainment rate, the entrainment dilution with shear in either of those measures. It's completely flat. It's also, the entrainment's been completely underestimated, right? It's been recorded as far too low in the model. I mean, somehow the anvils are above the level of neutral buoyancy. So this was a point picked up on for this generation of CP models by Andreas Prine in 2021. So the environmental controls and variability in entrainment with shear and also total column water, but it's far less of a strong influence and is the opposite scaling to rainfall, are being resolved by the newest generation models, but they're not being resolved by that old model. And if you correlate this against the rainfall scalings, it explains that trend. So what about the core areas? So in the idealized modeling, it was the core area change that was causing this. So for my cores, I'm looking at the W500 field again. I'm going to look at contiguous regions where W500 is above its 99th percentile in storm value. I'm using a percentile to account for the different distributions across the different resolution models. And what you can see, slightly surprisingly, is that all the models get an increase in this core metric with the wind shear, including CP4 and including the parameterized model where it was broken and the rainfall relationship isn't there and the entrainment scaling's not there. If you look at buoyancy, which I'm calculating using theta E at across these same regions, you've got in the explicit convection models an increase in buoyancy with shear, but not in the parameterized model. The buoyancies are higher in the new generation models. So this kind of hints that the dynamical core, which is common between all of these models, is getting something right. It's picking up on the increase in the area with shear, but the handover in the old model to the physics schemes, to the parameterization schemes, is going wrong, where this is leading into anvil heights, rainfall, and things like that. So the passover of this dynamical variability into the parameterization scheme in the models isn't working. So it's clearly your model physics in these explicit models, like your parameterization of the clouds and microphysics, is still absolutely essential for getting these effects right. So this also extends to mean rainfall in MCSs. So that was, my previous rainfall was maximum rainfall. You see similar things if you do total lifetime rainfall or total rainfall volume. So but this is mean, so it's including the scaling of the areas of the storms as well. So you can see it's much stronger against total column water. So green is the observations again. In some of the explicit models, like the 5 kilometer one, it's a little bit funny at low total column water, but the 2 kilometer one is getting this right. And this is a much stronger scaling than you see for the shear, which is down here. But in the shear relationship, CP4 is again wrong, and now it's not just flat, it's actually negative, so the mean rainfall is decreasing with the zonal shear, whereas in the newer generation models, this is increasing, but too steeply. And the reason for highlighting the shear relationship, other than that this is a talk about shear and MCSs, is that this shear relationship is the thing that maps onto the spatial distribution of the rainfall biases. So what I've got on the right-hand side of the slide is a percentage bias of MCS mean rainfall, not all mean rainfall, binned spatially against the observations, and it's a percentage difference. So you can see in the top panel, you've got a wet bias across the whole of the central Sahel region, where you might be able to see in the contours you have increased shear. Whereas in CP4 Africa, which has the decrease in mean rainfall with shear, you've got the opposite relationship. So you've got dry bias against the observed storms across the central Sahel, driven by this scaling. So these are, again, the 12Z mean. And if you do a correlation on this, that's significant, and it's the shear scaling, not the stronger total column water scaling, that explains this distribution. So these, I've taken the zonal mean across the distribution of the biases, and correlating them against the precursor environmental conditions. It's not significant for total column water for any of the models, but in the explicit new generation 2 kilometer model, you've got a positive correlation. So a higher shear, you're getting higher rainfall, exactly seen as that shear scaling, but this is now the geographic distribution, whereas this is negative in CP4. And because these are expressed as percentage biases, it's the mean rainfall, the stratiform rainfall with the stronger upper level heating profile that corresponds to the net input of diabatic heating into the atmosphere. So you're not only changing the rainfall distribution, you're also changing the heating distribution across the whole of West Africa. Big region at this time of year, that's one of the strongest areas of convection in the globe at this time. And this is going to have significant upscale impacts. We haven't shown any of the significant upscale impacts. I can't tell you what exactly it's going to cause. But by changing this distribution in the heating, because of how these storms are responding to the wind shear, those impacts are going to change, and you're going to see differences in the model. So 2 things that link to this is, firstly, when they first ever ran CP4 and they looked at the bulk seasonal biases, all the first kind of checks you do on your model, you see a dry bias for the monsoon season mean across the Sahel. This is the time when all this rainfall is being dominated by MCSs. Up to 90% of the rainfall at this time of year is coming from MCSs. This matches on surprisingly closely to what you see from just the MCS rainfall and the shear relationship. And another key point is that previous work by Panton Knippets at Karlsruhe has shown that if you resolve in an NWP model West African convection, the signals from changing that propagate north and south on the tropical jets, African easterly waves instead of a Rossby wave response, and they found an increase in forecast skill across the mid-latitudes. So what you do in your explicit convection model in West Africa matters for the rest of the globe. And some of this remains for future work to quantify how much is going to come down to how they're responding to the wind shear, which is then coming down to entrainment. So that was part 1. So to summary, stronger shear, you've got larger cores, reduced entrainment, and the new convection-permitting models from the Met Office can pick up on this. So we're hoping to look at this in things like the new ICON model. Emma's starting to do that now, and to also investigate what the changes, upscale changes that come from this are. So the second part of this is cold pools. So I mentioned that one of the big differences in these later generation models is that they now have a much more developed microphysics scheme. They have a two-moment, 5-species bulk microphysics scheme. We know that cold pools, shear interactions are critical for MCSs, so what's the role of that in this rainfall scaling? So to target that, what we've got is an experiment where we've turned off rainfall evaporation. So pool field has gone into the depths of the UM and turned off the evaporation from rainfall. And this suppresses the cold pools in the model. So lots of people have done similar experiments to this in the past. I haven't got anywhere near all of the ones. The key difference to any preceding experiment here is this is a 40-day explicit convection experiment with a fully realistic land surface and everything else. It's not an idealized modeling experiment. People have done it in explicit convection models as well, but this is a long-run one over the whole of Northern Africa. So we're looking at tropical storms in a high shear environment rather than a low shear oceanic environment, for example. So as you'd expect, what this does is it massively suppresses the cold pools. So this is two representative storms, and the shading is the buoyancy, low-level buoyancy. The contours are rainfall. So you can see in the control run, which is the 2.2 kilometer LAM from before, where I've got high rainfall, I'm generating a strong density current, strong cold pool, got a strong crust front here in the theta V gradient, and then ascending air in front of that cold pool. That's not there where I've turned off rainfall evaporation. There's no strong regions of negative buoyancy around that rainfall. If you think I have selected the storm to show what I want to show, this is if you zoom out for the same time step. This is in the first day of the model, so the synoptic differences haven't spun up yet. So you can see this is the theta V gradient. You've got these big purple cold pools, so that's where they're in the control. Where it's orange, that's where you've got a feature that's in the one with the rainfall evaporation off, and they're not there. You can also see from this that in West Africa, the cold pools are enormous. They can be the size of countries in this. So they form huge organized structures that are critical for the region's climate. But so what happens if I turn them off to the characteristics of the storms? So as you'd expect, you've got on the net reduced buoyancy. So this is composites about the mature storms at the peak of convection. So I've got much stronger buoyancy in the control. I've also flipped the theta E gradient across the storms. So if you look in the right-hand panel, I've got high theta E values in front of the storms, which you associate with the inflow that's going to be lifted over the cold pool. Whereas, this should have a theta, it does have a theta, sorry. This theta E gradient, you're not seeing the same thing. And in fact, if you plot this, you actually get it's a reversal. So you see the high theta V values are here in front of the storm. They're all propagating westwards. Whereas here, they're actually slightly behind the core, where I've turned off the cold pools, which is rain evap off. As you'd expect, it's much warmer without the cold pools. So this is the difference in the low-level temperatures. So you've got a strong positive value in the difference because it's much, much colder in the control where there's a cold pool. There's higher rainfall, which you'd expect because it's not evaporating, but only near the core of the storm. You've not got the linear features forming along the cold pools that are leading to enhanced rainfall in a large linear squall line structure. So I've actually got a bias towards rainfall in the control if you go north or south of the core location of the MCS. Now, where this gets more intriguing is where you look at things like propagation and the diurnal cycle. So in terms of storm speeds, this makes remarkably little difference to the distribution of the speeds of the storm. So this is done with a tracking algorithm called Simple Track. So the speeds slow down. It's a significant slowdown. It's about 1.5 meters per second. But this isn't due to cutting off the cold pools. This is due to a change in the African easterly jet. So by removing the cold pools, you've actually changed the meridional temperature gradient across Africa. And then by thermal wind response, the jet has changed. So the box plot at the top is the distribution of the daily African easterly jet. That has slowed down by the same amount. So the storms are following the speeds of the easterly jet. The lifetime of the storms doesn't go off a cliff, which I fully expected it would. So if you look beyond 10 hours, you've got the same kind of number distribution of really long-lived storms in both simulations. For the shorter, smaller isolated storms, you have got a peak towards shorter life cycles where they don't have cold pools. But beyond 10 hours, you've got the same kind of number of really long-lived propagating storms. And similarly in the diurnal cycle, so the counts of MCSs in the one without cold pools is in green here. It doesn't drop off until about 3 in the morning. And then it does substantially decrease. The cold pools are somehow enabling the storms to keep going beyond that time, but nocturnal propagation is not being cut off by removing them. And you also see differences in the rainfall diurnal cycle. So without the cold pools, it's a pretty flat distribution in the mean maximum rainfall from the storms at each hour. But you see a really strong peak in a nocturnal maximum rainfall where you have cold pools in the storms, which is what's seen in observation. So for example, in Vizzy and Cook 2018. So the cold pools are clearly contributing towards an intensification process that's enabling those higher maximum rainfall rates. And when you plot them through the night, the cold pools get stronger until about 3 a.m. in the control simulation. So what does this look like in the interaction with the shear in the zonal profile? So this does exactly what you would expect from our classic understanding of the interaction with the cold pool shear interaction based on horizontal vorticity balance, which I'm sure you're all far more familiar with than me. So in the control run where you have a cold pool, you've got a backwards tilt of the updraft over that cold pool and then going up to 200 hectopascals, then the flow diverging at the top. So the shading on the left-hand column is convergence. Shading on the right-hand column is a theta E anomaly, so you can see high theta E values in the updraft inflow over the cold pool. And you can actually see a cold pool in this. This is this dashed line here, which is a buoyancy contour. In the top row, there's no cold pool to balance the vorticity gradient, and it's bending further forwards, exactly as you would expect. The vertical velocity, which is in the solid contours, is tilting forwards. And same with the inflow is coming now somehow from behind my core composite location, which is the location of minimum brightness temperature, and tilting forwards down shear. So this is going to change the mesoscale circulation of the storms, but you can still have the mesoscale circulation just with the thermal forcing, which this is generating. Now, that's going exactly as we would expect. But what about the scaling of the rainfall and the shear? And this does not do what you would expect. So green is the one without cold pools, purple is the one with cold pools, and this is the scaling of maximum rainfall with the wind shear, and there's no change at all, which we thought there would be. This is why we ran the experiment. So the change we made in the microphysics scheme has not affected whether the model picks up on that shear response. There's also mean rainfall, minimum brightness temperature. So without the cold pools and no rainfall evaporation, those are slightly weakened. But the physics of the entrainment scaling with the shear is remaining the same. So if you remember my WF and BT diff metrics, these are still scaling in the same way at leading order, but they have some important sub-leading effects. So you can see the gradient for the one without cold pools is slightly weaker. So there's a positive feedback going here from having a cold pool. The entrainment is higher, and similarly in BT diff. There's also quite a significant difference in how the core areas are scaling. The core areas are getting generally smaller and not scaling as strongly with the cold pools. So two things about this is you say, well, what's it doing to the mean state? And you could go and all the effects on the wind. The main thing I've got to say about this is it corresponds nicely with papers from the Cascade project from 10 years ago from the UK. Which did some of the first continental scale convection-permitting modeling. So they showed the cold pools are key for the ventilation of the Sahara, the diurnal cycle of the West African monsoon. All the temperature biases we see align exactly with the results that came from those results. The other key thing is in the propagation of these hypothetical storms with no rainfall evaporation, we actually find they have much stronger low-level convergence across the Sahel domain. So this is mean 300 kilometer mean, 925 hectopascal convergence. And you can see where there aren't cold pools, actually most of this region at midnight has strong, not strong, but low-level convergence. The strong bits are coming from orography, which I'm not looking at. And that, by Crook and Moncrief in 1988, has also been shown to be able to facilitate MCS propagation through gravity wave mechanisms. There's also going to be an important role of the dry line, the intertropical discontinuity here. So this in the control lines up nicely with what you see in observations from Busy and Cook. So we may well be doing some kind of sort of shift in the dry line, like with the soil moisture patterns, by removing the cold pools, but that remains to be investigated. And I am out of time, so I will not show these land surface results, but I can, if you're interested, go through them later. So I'll just stick to my conclusions. So the current generation explicit convection 5-kilometer grid scale models in the UM now are able to capture the response of storms to both shear and moisture. So previously it was just moisture. The reason why is that they now pick up on this effect where entrainment decreases as you strengthen the background shear. You have larger cores, and that leads to greater rainfall. This is going to have upscale impacts. It's affecting the distribution of storm rainfall and therefore heating across Africa. And that change doesn't appear to have come from the microphysics scheme. And if you suppress cold pools in this region, the slowdown isn't from the cold pools, it's from the large-scale synoptic changes. There's no change in this shear relationship and only subleading changes in the entrainment relationships. And there is large-scale convergence to support propagation. And then, this is the bit I haven't shown you. We're doing some things to mess with the scales of the soil moisture that I showed you from the observations, how and what scales storms are sensitive to in the land surface, and how that propagates through the boundary layer into storm dynamics to control things like convective intensity. So I can show them if there's any natural questions on that, but otherwise I'll shut up. Thank you very much.
Great. I imagine there will be some questions.
Well, first of all, fascinating stuff. I came late, so I wanted to ask you, what level were you measuring the shear through when you're talking about the relationship?
Yep. So the shear is, just in case you didn't see this plot, I'll go back to the climatology plot. The shear is fully zonal, and it's 650 hectopascals to 850 hectopascals, which for this region corresponds to about 800 meters to about 3.5 kilometers in the atmosphere-ish, in the geopotential. And the reason for this is the difference between African easterly jet and the monsoon flow. An important point, actually, that I didn't say is that a difference in this region to the US is that the dominant control on this shear is the mid-levels, not a low-level jet. So if you just use the 650 hectopascal winds, you get similar results. It's the strongest winds here are in the jet at 650.
Thank you. The reason I'm asking this question is there's an experiment in Montana in 1981 called the Cooperative Convective Precipitation Experiment, or COPE. And one of the things that we did with that, we looked at the relationship of cloud size with shear.
Okay, yeah.
And interestingly enough, the clouds got bigger with larger shear.
We find that too.
Yeah, and so that's an observational result. So it's really gratifying to see because a lot of people were very skeptical about that paper.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, so you see it in the satellite observations. I can get it up if you want. You see it in the satellite observations from Meteosat, but you also see it in the models.
Yeah, and one proposed mechanism I imagine you're familiar with Terry Clark years ago, was looking at the shear on top of the boundary layer and found that if you get the right kind of shear, it makes the boundary layer, the scales of the eddies in the boundary layer get larger to match the gravity wave, so you end up with larger.
I'm not familiar with that, so I'd be fascinated to learn more.
Yeah, okay.
That would be great.
Thank you. I'll let you know the reference.
Thank you.
Speak as a modeler, I think it's even more gratifying when the model matches the obs.
Yeah. And when you're able to understand why the model was wrong as well, has been quite surprisingly satisfying.
So this is really interesting. I had a couple questions. I guess the first one I have is when you turned off the rain evaporation, I'm curious what kind of storm mode you got, morphology. You called them still MCSs, but
Yeah,
were they
okay.
actually linear MCSs, or were there supercells in there?
I don't know in full detail, so I haven't actually done much deep digging down into the morphology, and it's definitely something we should do more. There are people at Leeds doing more on-storm shapes and morphologies. Something I could definitely say by eye when you look at the results is they're far less squall line-like, and you can see that in the composite, right, where you don't have that linear strong rainfall. Like you can really see and you can see it in those cold pool gradient plots that they're big linear structures. You see kind of more. The areas still get large. I mean, yeah, the morphology in detail remains something I need to look at more. No idea about supercells, I'm afraid. To my knowledge, supercells aren't that common in West Africa.
Yeah, I figured they wouldn't be, but maybe when you turn off evaporation, that might change the...
No, that would be a really interesting thing to look at, actually. I mean, it's not directly the same, but there has been some work looking at vorticity budgets and like vorticity structures in MCSs by Fran Morris in the UK. So we could do, pursue something in that line, but yeah. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess the other real quick was, maybe you mentioned this, and I may have missed it, but when you were comparing the different models and you were showing the one that was the highest resolution one I thought you showed was the 2.2, that seemed to be the best. So how much of that is just because you got a high resolution, you're resolving the systems better?
Yeah. Hard to pin down, right? Couldn't say for definite. I think the key thing, which you can see from the fact that the 4.5 kilometer model didn't get the thing at all, the key thing is the model physics. It's something in the physics parameterizations that are going, the grays and gray zone problem that are going with that is leading to the leading order change. But high resolution is definitely improving the sub-leading order changes.
Thanks.
Perhaps not very important comment is that when you just suppress rain evaporation, you're basically changing the column heating, if you like.
Yep.
And you can do a little bit better, if you like, more physically by basically distributing this cooling at low levels over larger area. And we've done it in some kind of convection, high-resolution LES simulations.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Transition, and because the cold pools, of course, play a role in daytime convective development.
Yeah.
So it perhaps a minor point, but you can do better just simply cutting off rain evaporation.
I completely agree.
Kind of keeping track of the mean heating, and it probably doesn't have much impact on kind of convective scale, but on what happens on a larger scale, it may actually be important. But anyway, just
I can show you, well, as it's come up, I can show you the change to the mean state, which I relegated to extra material.
Yeah, that's basically what it is, because you're changing mean state rather than keeping mean state and making the evaporation kind of spread over the entire area.
I mean, certainly one deficiency with the model setup is we didn't do anything to other microphysics species. So, I mean, ground is still evaporating, ice is still evaporating, hence why, there's still
because that's the low-level evaporation that kind of drives cold pool, So,
I mean, in this, you can see, this is the thermal gradient I was talking about. So over the Sahel, where most of the storms are, it's a lot hotter because it's not being cooled by the rainfall evaporation. There's a lot more moisture. It's a lot wetter. And that maybe comes as a surprise because obviously it's not evaporating into the column. But the reason for that is it's warmer and it's moist, so you have higher evaporation from the surface, which is here in contours, but the contours are terrible, so I apologize. But so there is a higher evaporation going on in the one without the cold pools, where the rainfall evaporation has been turned off. And so this is the zonal difference in the wind speeds. So the easterly jet at 650 hectopascal. So the atmosphere for West Africa is basically barotropic in the mean. So the geostrophic velocity is kind of the same as the thermal wind. And you can see that the change lines up with the gradient, the change in the temperature. So you've got a strengthened gradient here, so that's reducing the westerly winds. and you've got a decrease in the easterly speeds here.
I'd like a comment on this business about the density currents versus gravity waves. The big difference, you didn't see much difference in the big perspective. The reason is this, I think, that there's a really interesting business about the strength of the horizontal pressure gradient across the system with the vertical shear.
Which is what's in the parameterization scheme that you're using,
That's
right?
correct.
Yeah.
And in fact, I suspect that the pressure gradient is pretty much the same.
Okay.
And the dynamics of the density currents is not all that different from gravity
So
waves.
yeah, okay.
It's structurally in some respects, but not in big numbers. Okay, so you may want to look at that.
I shall.
We'll talk about that later.
No, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for the suggestion.
I have a quick question. So it was interesting that I forgot what the older model was called. AF something.
CP4.
Yeah. Okay. It was interesting that still had this relationship between core size and shear and buoyancy, but you said there was like something with the physics. I'm wondering if you thought about looking at precipitation efficiency to try and untangle that. There's a way that Julia has developed where you can get the things needed for precip efficiency, like condensation rate in particular, from just state variables. So
No, I mean,
assuming you guys already.
Yeah, and I've saw the preprint. I mean, I think, and I absolutely would like to test it out. I mean, I think these kind of, I think the thing that I think is great about your guys' work is, I mean, it's far more sophisticated bulk measure than what I've got for entrainment, right? Mine is pretty crude. So, but developing these kind of process tests for these new models is from the state variables that are output is crucial. So yeah, looking at the precipitation efficiency in these would be fantastic test. I mean, I think it would also be really interesting for this rainfall evaporation. I mean, Julia's first question was like, oh, so is it going to, the precipitation efficiency is going to be like 1? And I'm like, well, is it 1? How much is Graupel playing a role?
There's still cloud evaporation too.
Yeah.
I imagine in this run you didn't turn.
So it'd be really interesting to quantify.
One other quick question then about kind of the state variable thing. Have you thought about maybe looking at a conserved or quasi-conserved variable to try and get at dilution a little bit more directly, like theta E? Theta E won't work, when you get ice and stuff, but it's a little bit more direct from your other sort of proxies for entrainment.
No, actually, not for the content. So, no, that's a lie. So I did look at, when I was first trying to investigate this, we first used the BT-diff one because a postdoc at Leeds, Michael Baidu, did it in observations and found things consistent with the idealized results for Meteosat MCSs. So what we tried to do was look at the difference in the 500 hectopascal mean theta E and then the inflow into the storms. The problem I had was identifying the inflow correctly. Like, the composites I've shown, in those histograms, this is over about 2,500 MCSs. So I can't go through and identify the inflow bit manually. So finding a way where I actually was properly finding the inflow air going up was really, really tricky. I thought I got it right, actually. I mean, I did one of these, and then you missed a factor of 273 from a temperature conversion or something, and it was complete bollocks. So maybe with this, where I'm actually tracking the storms, and it knows something about the direction, you could improve that. So remains to be seen. But when I tried initially, it failed.
Yeah, actually really sensitive, obviously, the theta E that you choose for your initial state. Any other questions? All right, if not, let's thank the speaker.
Thank you very much. I guess it's just worth me saying I'm here tomorrow at Mesa Lab, and then I'm in Fort Collins next week. And I'm here this afternoon if anyone wants to chat.